All right, this video is kind of dedicated to Craig since he's been a little bit trepid about getting into soldering, or hopefully this will help him feel more comfortable entering the wide world of soldering. But if it helps anybody else, then that'll be good too. Before you start, first thing you want to do is make sure you have a nice clean workbench. Maybe next time. All right, next, let's get our materials together. Solder here, flux pen, or I do have, I mean, you can use flux paste, but it's the same thing. I really only bought the paste for, well, an upcoming build, but for pretty much all jobs or all intents and purposes, flux pen will be fine. I like to use some tweezers, and then got the solder iron, or the soldering iron, ready to go. What we're doing today is, what I need to do and what Craig needs to do is just swap out a new 4in1 ESC or a bad 4in1 ESC. But as far as your temperature, my iron goes to 5, and so I've got it like at 4, 4.25 or almost 4.5. So I guess whatever your iron is set to, I keep mine about 80, a little over 80%, so 85% of its maximum temperature here. I'm just letting it heat up right now. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go ahead and set this here, so hopefully that'll be visible. First, I'm gonna go ahead and prep, or I'm gonna add a little bit of flux to these wires here, because I just want to desolder these and remove them off of the bad ESC. And I'm not going to claim to have any great soldering skills or anything like that, but gets the job done, I guess. All right, I just wiped off my soldering iron. Check to see if it's hot enough. You really want the solder to just melt right as it hits, and so we do have that going for us. We've got flux on the motor wires. So what I'm gonna do is reach around here. I'm gonna pull on the wire with the pliers as I touch the iron to the pad. Just a gentle pulling. While I do that, you see that comes off. We'll go on to the next one. Same thing, just keep that pressure, a medium pressure. You're not trying to jam down on the pads here, which I guess it doesn't really matter since the CSC is blowing anyways, but just a gentle pressure, keep it in contact with the solder joint. Let's get this last wire here. All right, there we go. So we've got our first motor removed. Hop over here to the second one. Grab this wire, have a little pressure pulling on it as we touch the iron to the pad. And that smoke coming off, that's the flux burning up. Grab this next wire, a little pressure pulling as we touch the iron to the pad. And finally, for this final wire. All right. I guess that should be good. Well, I'll flip it around and we'll do all of them. Frequently, so as you go through either desoldering or soldering on, whichever the case may be, you may notice that your tip may get some black spots or a little bit of I don't know, what is it, oxidation, burnt flux, whatever's on there. Whatever you're using, whether it's a sponge or the brass wiring, just every few kind of solder joints, you just want to wipe the tip off and then add a little bit of fresh solder onto it before you go on to the next job. All right, so we'll flip this thing around and get the rest of the motor wires undone. All right, same as last time. We have the wires here that we want to take off. So I'm just going to add some flux from the pin, just a little bit on all these joints. I'm going to clean off the soldering iron, add a little bit more. Before, you always want to have a little bit of solder on there before you're doing anything. whether soldering on or desoldering. All right, so we've got our tip with some solder. I'm gonna reach over here, grab this wire. All right, same as last time. So we're gonna gently pull on the wire as we touch the iron to the joint, and it's gonna come right off. Again, just a light pressure, not too heavy, but at the same time, not too light. You wanna make sure that it's constantly touching the solder joint as you're pulling. Once you touch the iron to that joint, just leave it where it is and just keep that gentle pulling pressure until it pops off. All right, there we go. I'm gonna go ahead and clean off the iron one more time. Put a little bit more solder on. Remember, we've got our flux on the last few joints, so we're good on that. Having solder on the iron helps transfer heat, so it helps transfer heat, so it's actually going to heat up the joint you're trying to solder or desolder quicker than just having no solder on the tip. All right, so taking each one of these wires, a gentle pulling as we touch the iron to the joint, medium pressure. And the last one, I guess be careful. You see, I always work, I try to turn or manipulate whatever I'm working on. I try to make it so that the soldering iron isn't crossing over too much. So you saw once I finished this side here, I flipped the quad around so I'm not having to reach over or come over anything with the soldering iron. So just be careful what you're soldering around. All right, boom. This ESC is officially desoldered. All right, before we go further, I guess I want to show you something that I kind of take for granted, or anytime you're explaining something that I guess you've been doing for a while, you kind of assume that people are going to do some things that you do without saying it. But you notice earlier when you're kind of pulling, you've got one hand pulling on the wire and then you got your other hand holding the iron. So you don't want the quad sliding around. I don't know if you guys, you know, I do have a set of these little helping hands. I have to say, I only got them because they were pretty cheap, but I haven't used them very much. I think I've used them once or twice. I typically just use, the blue putty is around here somewhere, but here's a new pack. I mean, this is what I use. I take this out of Loctite putty, and you can ball it up. You guys should be able to see kind of under there. I just put a little bit of tack and press down on this motor. I think there's a little bit under here as well, maybe. So that way, as I pull on the quad, you know, it's not going to slide around. That's not going to really help you if you're trying to desolder something and the quad is sliding with you. Okay, so we've desoldered the ESC. I've got this off now. If I would have been thinking, or if I would have known I was going to make this video, I would have waited to tin up the new ESC. But well, it's over. I've already tinned this up, or I did this yesterday. But here's what am I trying to say? When I say tin up the pad, like when you get the new 4in1, all these little joints are just, you know, shiny brass. So what you do is you put some solder on them before you connect the wire. So you don't want to try to feed the wire and solder onto a whole new fresh pad. That's just too much going on, because then you'd have solder, your iron, and the wire all together. So you tin these up first. And you know, so if you already know what tinning up or whatever means, that's fine. But just if you're not sure exactly about that, when you get this new ESC or this 4in1, you know, like I said, all this will be shiny brass, all these pads. Similar steps as far as the desoldering. What I do is I take the flux pen, I'll go around and I'll just wipe some flux on all these pads, and I'll get the soldering iron ready, about 85% temperature for me. And then I'll make sure the solder tip is clean. I'll clean it off. I'll add some fresh solder to it, And then once I've added fresh solder to my iron, what I'll do is, oh, and also, so again, what I'll do is I'll have a little bit of that tack, and I'll put a little bit of that tack on the underside of the ESC and kind of press that down a little bit so that it'll stay where it needs to be while I'm soldering with it. So what we'll do is we'll have this kind of secured down. We've got flux around all the pads. We're gonna clean the solder tip, add some fresh solder, and then as we have our solder in the other hand, what I do is I touch the iron to this little brass pad, because you want to heat up the pad just for a second or two. You want to heat up the pad by itself before you start feeding more solder onto it, so that the solder will flow onto the pad and not just try to run up the solder tip. What I do is once I solder up the tip of the iron, I'll touch it to the pad, and you'll kind of start to see some of that flux smoke up and burn off shortly after. And once I see some of that wet solder from the tip start to slide onto the pad, that's when I start feeding the extra solder in. And as you feed, let me set this camera down. This should be in view. As you touch the iron to the pad and you start to see some of the solder from the tip flow onto the pad, that's when you're going to start feeding in more solder. And the way you want to do that is you want to keep the iron exactly where it is. You're not moving the iron, you're just pushing solder onto the pad with your left hand. And I kind of push it onto the tip, and as it touches the tip, it's going to kind of like fall down onto the pad. So you'll have the tip about here on the pad, and then you'll be touching the solder to the tip just as it kind of meets the pad, and you'll see it start to flow down and stick onto the pad. Again, it would have been really helpful if I kind of waited to tin this up, but you know, it is what it is. You can find other videos on YouTube of tinning stuff up as well. But what I would like to show you also is, I'll move this out of the way. Just if you're not really sure exactly, and here's what I'm talking about. I put a little bit of this tack here, and then I'll press it down, and that way, kind of as you're pulling or doing whatever, it's hopefully going to stay still. But I guess if you're not sure what exactly the purpose of flux is, or kind of the role flux plays in soldering, I'll show you here. And so I'll just clean this tip off. And also a reminder, anytime you clean the tip off, you want to get solder on it right away. Leave it soldered when you're storing it, and just kind of try to always have solder on it so it doesn't mess up or get dirty. But if I try to solder this joint with no flux, or at least whatever flux is still off of it, let's see what happens. And I'll keep messing around on this pad and see if I can burn this flux off. Which actually, so that's lasting a pretty good while. You see how that joint here that I'm let me see, is that in? Yeah, this joint is staying pretty smooth for the most part. But what we should see now is that I've steadily continued to apply heat. That's not bad. I figured it was going to burn up long before this, but so that gives you plenty of time to operate. But as you see, like, okay, so now you'll notice when I touch the iron to the solder and it's melting, and I'll go to pull away, it's starting to, like, I don't know, can you guys see that? It's starting to lift up like an ice cream cone or something. And so that's that flux starting to burn out. And it kind of makes the solder become like burnt chocolate. And so if you've ever, you know, when burnt chocolate gets that gritty texture, and you can't just put it in the microwave and reheat it and like have it flow back together. So that's still not too bad though. What I'll do here now is I'm gonna put a little bit more flux on this pad. And when I put some flux back on here, and touch the iron to it, you should notice we'll get kind of like that that little shiny puddle or that shiny surface again. And I'm gonna go ahead and put some flux on all of these while we're at it, so we can see what that looks like. All right, I wipe my tip off. I'm gonna put a little solder on here. All right, now what we should see is when we touch this just lightly to this pad, we should be able to hold it there just for a little second and let off, and it'll be back to that kind of, there you go, see? You see we added that flux on there. I touched it down just for a second, pulled up, and we didn't have it trying to follow us. We have just kind of like an even, or you know, smooth surface here. And if you can look at these other solder joints here, you can see how they're not even from when we desoldered the wires kind of pulled it away. We can kind of, what I like to do is if I'm changing a motor or something, let's say I was going to solder back onto this ESC, before I do that, I like to go ahead and I added my flux all along here, and I want to just smooth these joints back out again first. And so what I'll do is I'll touch the pad to each one, or touch the tip to each one just for a moment. You guys see how it got shinier? You saw that flux burn away, and now the joint is kind of smooth again. Let's do this here. Yep, there you go. Should notice the same thing here. I'm just going to press it down just for a couple seconds. You should see when I pull away it's shiny and it doesn't try to follow the iron tip. So that's what the solder, or the flux does for you. It helps to, well, smooth your solder back out or help it flow back together. All right, and this last one. So there you go. That's a tip. If you're ever need to change a motor, so you desolder the motor and you want to put it back on, that's my advice before you try to solder back on, is that you reflux this and then clean your joints back up, like just touch with the iron to get them back smooth. So that way, now when you come back in with your motor wire, you can have like a nice surface to work back with. But I guess we'll get to that in a moment. So we have our, if you didn't have one already, you know, we have our XT60 lead now. Of course, Craig, I think in your case, you just need to solder back on, which I won't lie, this is for me, this is the hardest part. I struggle a lot with the large solder pads. I don't know what it is. I don't know if my heat's too high, if I'm just not making enough contact, but I won't lie, I do struggle when attaching the battery leads to these solder pads. These are easy for me. I love these, but these I struggle with. But let's go through the process. Anyways, how I'm going to attach these here is, remember, I don't want to come across anything that I don't need to with my soldering iron. So I'm going to actually flip this ESC around this way, and let's maybe, let me move this camera a little bit. So I'll show you what's going to be happening is I'm going to be having the iron here, and I'm going to come across from this end, or from the right side, heating up the pad here as I'm feeding the positive and negative from the left side. So I'll be with my left hand, I'll be feeding the wire in here and then applying heat from the right side. So let's see what we can do here. I know let's get that in the light. All right, so let's pick back up where we left off. Let's see, I've put the ESC in here, or put it in the stack. All we need to do is solder the motor wires back on. So we're going to do kind of what we've been doing, which is just put a little bit of flux on each of these before we solder the motor wires back in. And what we're going to do is we're going to run the motor wires. If you can see, like here, is they're going to go to the inside and then wrap around to the ESC. That way it just kind of ends up, you end up with a little bit cleaner build overall. So you have your wires going through the inside and then back out. That way they're not exposed, or at least exposed less on the outside. All right, so we're going to start with this motor, motor 2 first. I'm going to run, so we have the standoff here, I'm going to run the motor wires to the inside and bring them back around to these three. Since these motor wires have been attached before, they're kind of at a few different lengths. I just wanted to trim them up as short as possible. So I've got the shortest wire is going to hook around to this first one, and then medium, and then longest here. So we'll get all the other ones out of our way. And I'm going to try my best to kind of reach around the camera with the tweezers here and just, well, we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to find my shortest wire first, which it looks like it's this one. So I'll have this one come around here. All right, let's do that. I'm gonna go ahead. Got my solder iron heated up. I'm gonna wipe off any excess. Put some fresh solder on the end. And ideally, we should just be able to touch these wires to the pad and have them fuse. All right, so same as before, we touched the iron down to the solder and just kind of fed the wire in to the heated solder. So what I'll do is I'll touch the iron to the pad, let that solder heat up. At the same time, let's see which one we're doing next. Let's go with this one. So I'm going to touch the iron to this pad, and I'm going to let that, once I see the solder start to melt, I'm going to just start with my left hand. I've kind of got a little bit of pressure that's sliding it toward the pad. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here. Before I even touch the iron down, I'm going to start here with this wire kind of having momentum. And once I touch the iron to the pad and this heats up, it should allow the wire to slide on in. I'll leave it there just for a little second longer, let it all melt together, and then we're done. All right, grab our wire. We've got it kind of pushing onto the pad. So I bring my iron from the right, touch it to the first, or touch it to the pad until the wire starts to slide in. We'll leave it there, kind of let it all melt together. I'd rather have that better, but that's fine. We've got a nice solid connection. Let's go ahead with our third wire. Again, grab it with the tweezers. I'm going to kind of give a little bit of pressure like toward the right, so that as soon as that solder pad melts, it kind of lets the wire slide in. And I'm just kind of lightly touching the pad with my soldering iron. But once you touch it and it starts to melt, just leave it right where it is. Don't press further or don't back up. You want to keep that constant heat. All right, it might seem simple to just have your left hand push and your right hand stay still, but it does take a little bit of time to kind of get that coordination together with the pressure from the soldering iron and then the the direction from the motor wire. All right, so we clean off the tip. I'm gonna add a little bit more solder on right now. Well, actually, so I should have set up my wires here a little bit first. All right, so I'm going to run these motor wires on the inside of this standoff here, so that way they're kind of tucked inside once I put my flight controller on. I'm going to start with this longest wire. So this, at least the way I have it, is the longest comes out here. All right, if you find, so this is what's going on right now. I'm kind of touching the iron to the pad. It's acting like it's not wanting to heat up like the others. So something's going on. I don't know what it is, but if this happens, just kind of like stop and just let's regroup. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clean the tip back off, put some more solder on it and just come at it again. But what I'm also gonna do is add a little bit more flux on this pad, since we burned some off from our first attempt. So hopefully that'll let it flow on a little bit better. All right, so let's come at this thing again and see what we can do. right, if you see we had a little bit better luck this time. I don't really like how the wire is still just kind of right up there at the top, so I'm gonna see if I can get it down even a little bit further. Okay, I like that better. Let's go on to our next one, kind of the medium length wire. All right, we've got 2 motors done. I'll go ahead and flip around the quad so we can kind of work again from the right side, or at least bring the soldering iron from the right side. All right, I'll start it here since we've got, I don't know, it's pretty busy up here. Same as before. Make sure we've got flux on these joints here. Going to, let me see how my wires are lined up. Looks like that's going to go to the outside one, medium, so this will be the short one here. Alright, should be able to clean this iron, put a little bit of solder on the end. I've got the pads with some flux on them. I should be able to finish off all 3 of these motor wires without having to clean or do anything like that. All right, we are done. I think I'm done with the iron now, so I'm gonna make sure it's got a little bit, you wanna leave a little bit of solder on the tip before you're done, so I'm gonna put this up. Put that down to 2 for now. I'm gonna put the stand up back on, and then I guess we'll cut back once I'm about to power up. All right, okay, here's a moment of truth. I've got flight controller connected back, so that all the motor wires are connected up. I guess I can take this off now. All the motor wires are connected up. Of course, on this one I have some LEDs here, but we've got, like I said, flight controller connected, all the other stuff. If you've got your VTX connected, remember just make sure you've got a antenna plugged in. I am going to make sure that I put in a smoke stopper first. I mean, everything looked pretty clean, but anytime you're kind of trading something out or doing some solder work, or at least I do always, before I plug back up, I put a smoke stopper in first. We don't want to burn anything out. All right, so got a smoke stopper in. Let me get a LiPo. Here we go. All right, so let's see what we have going on here. All right, so we definitely got something going on there. We need to get our second tone. All right, take 2. Make sure when you solder, make sure when you're soldering up the cable to your flight controller from the ESC, don't do like I just did. I soldered all the connector wires here, and then I had this connector coming back into the flight controller, and I was wondering why I didn't get the second set of tones for the ESC. All right, so hopefully now that we've got this connector and the ESC itself where it should be, we should get a second startup tone once we plug it in. And so I guess if you don't know, when you plug it in, you get the doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. The first part, the doo-doo-doo, that means ESC has power. The second two tones means there's communication with the flight controller. So since I didn't get that second set, meaning there's no communication with my flight controller, and of course there wasn't because I had it, or I didn't have the plug connected. All right, so here we go. Take two, smoke stopper in. Let's see what we got. Yay. There you go. I guess I can turn my radio on and see if the motor spin up. All right, let's plug up and see if we can get these motors spinning. Fantastic. That's the throttle. All right, we can check our motor direction. Of course, if you're running standard props, you want motors 2 and 3. Motors 2 and 3 spinning counterclockwise. And then you want motors 1, 2, 3, 4. Motors 1 and 4, you want those spinning clockwise. So let's check that right now. Motor 2, counterclockwise, that's good. Motor 3, counterclockwise, that's great. Motor 4, clockwise. And then motor 1 is clockwise, and I'm just running my finger lightly in the direction they should be going, and since the motor's already turning that way, I'm not getting any resistance. If I were to go the opposite way, I could definitely tell. That's it. Craig, good luck, buddy, and then anybody else who watches, I hope, you know, maybe it helped out, or I don't know, whatever. If you have any more questions, you can let me know. All right, peace.